Welcome back to our live coverage of the 6th International Community-Based Adaptation Conference coming to you from Hanoi in Vietnam. You've just been listening to Willie Atu sharing his experiences in the Solomon Islands. Delighted to be joined now by Saleemul Huq again, who is going to answer a few of your questions which have come in over the last day or so, and also give us a bit of a wrap-up of the day today. Saleem, first off, I wanted to pick up a question sent in by someone called Ahmed, and he was grappling with the difference between adaptation and community-based adaptation, because shouldn't all good development work and certainly all adaptation be led by the communities in question? So really, isn't adaptation just bad community-based adaptation?
Well, there's a lot of truth to that argument, but it isn't completely true in my view. One of the things about adaptation to climate change is that it's a very young science, and we're learning a lot more as we go along. And I'd say one of the evolutions in learning has been that we started off thinking that adapting to climate change was all about a particular locality. It's about helping people cope with the impacts of climate change that are going to happen where they are, to continue to be able to live their lives and livelihoods where they are. Increasingly, we now know that there are some parts of the world, and they're growing in numbers, low-lying coastal areas, islands, some of the drought-prone mid-continents, where over the next 10, 20, 30 years, people are simply not going to be able to live there the way they have been. Those people are going to have to be helped to move somewhere else. And they number in the tens of millions, if not more. They can't adapt at the local level. They may be in the short term, but in the long term, they can't. So we need to think of it both as a short-term and a long-term measure. We need to think of it both at the local level, but also at the higher scales of activities as well. If there's a large city that's affected by climate change and has to be protected by a major infrastructure. London is a good example. London has the Thames Barrier. The UK government's going to put £1 billion into upgrading the Thames Barrier to protect London from flooding. That's not community-based adaptation. No community could have done that on their own. The central government has to do that for the whole of London City. So there are some scales on which, higher scales where communities by themselves can't do it. But I do believe that communities are at the core, and they need to be involved in whatever activities are being done, and therefore that's a good place to start.
So when we talk about mainstreaming community-based adaptation and bringing policymakers on board, what role do you see governments having in community-based adaptation if it tends to be kind of a smaller initiative?
Well, I think the main lesson from my point of view for national and global policymakers from the efforts at the bottom, at the grassroots with communities, is to enable policymakers to understand that communities are not victims and not necessarily the recipients of a top-down development process. They have a lot of capabilities, they have a lot of knowledge, they're increasingly gaining more knowledge on, and so the role of the policymaker needs to be much more supportive rather than simply treating them as the recipients of top-down policies. And that's basically the advocacy, if you like, from the community-based adaptation to policymaking that we want to be mainstreamed, which is that communities need to be consulted, they have knowledge, they have capacities that need to be built up on, and they should not be treated simply as victims of top-down policies.
And to what extent is this a global phenomenon? Because for obvious reasons, most of the people here are from the countries being affected first and worst. But I'm intrigued by you mentioning the Thames Barrier in London. Are we seeing community-based adaptation in more developed countries as well? Increasingly so.
And I'll give you several examples. The Inuit in Canada are being affected very badly, and they are being organized. The Indians around in Louisiana who are affected by Katrina are getting organized at the community level. Some of the councils in New York City are getting together at community level. Australia is doing a lot in some of the drought-prone areas, some of the flood-prone areas of Australia. Australia is paradoxically can be hit by droughts and floods at the same time in different parts of the country. And increasingly the communities that are being affected are getting their acts together and saying that they need to organize themselves and develop community-based adaptation. So even though it started off in the more vulnerable and poorer countries, it is now spreading much more widely. And when we started a few years ago, maybe there were dozens of examples. Now there are hundreds of examples, and soon there'll be thousands of them.
few areas of the climate crisis where we can tell good news. Why isn't it more high profile?
Well, I think there's a reluctance in the global media, if you like, to see this as a good news story or a positive story. First of all, because global media is Western or Northern dominated, and so what happens in a poor developing country isn't news at the global level unless it's a terrorist attack. Good news stories from poor communities don't make it into the global media. On the other hand, the general framing of the climate change issue, even in the context of impacts on vulnerable communities, has been very much as a negative story. They are vulnerable, they are poor, they are going to be impacted. But the story is changing dramatically. They're not sitting idle, they're not waiting for it to hit them. They're taking actions, they're preparing themselves, in some cases doing it very, very well. So we need to turn that negative into a positive, and that's the challenge for us. It's happening on the ground. That news isn't hitting the global media yet. We hope that it will.
Okay, and I just want to pick up on one of the challenges that's actually been mentioned in a question put to us as well. When you talk about adaptation and the transfer of resources to developing countries in order to cope with the climate crisis, people will often challenge you and say, well, actually, there's huge corruption in some of these countries. Should we really be sending money there in order to cope with this? And it's often used by skeptics to challenge these policies, but in it, also maybe there is some basis to it. Do you face the same kinds of challenges when it comes to community-based adaptation?
Well, I think the answer to the corruption problem is that there is corruption, and we can't deny that. I would argue that what we are trying to do is one means of minimizing corruption. I'd say there are two arguments here. Firstly, at the global level, poor, vulnerable countries that are going to be hit by the impacts of climate change have contributed very, very little to the cause of the problem. And therefore, there's a matter of right and justice that those that polluted and caused the problem owe them money. If they don't spend that money well, it's not an excuse for not giving them the money that's owed. Okay. If you owe somebody money, you don't say, I'm not going to pay it to you because you're going to drink it. Okay? So you owe money, you pay money. On the other hand, there is an argument for saying that money needs to be well spent. And that's where community-based adaptation comes in. If the communities are empowered with knowledge about these funds that are coming in from the global level, they can hold their own governments to account and say, it better be spent on us, on the poor and the vulnerable, and not spent on buying big cars and houses for yourselves. So that it reinforces transparency in the process, reinforces the obligation of the governments to make sure that actual poor, vulnerable people are benefited from these funds that might come in from the international level. So community-based adaptation is a means of minimizing, not avoiding, but minimizing corruption.
Okay. And just finally, I want to touch on the conference today. It's looking at the agenda. It looked an exciting day. Gender coming up. I noticed also the role of video, digital photography. What were your highlights from today?
Well, I think my highlight is twofold. Firstly, the traditional way we've done these in thematic sessions on gender, on agriculture, on water, disaster risk reduction, etc. This is a repeated pattern. More and more people are doing things and sharing them. That went well. But I think this time around we did some what we call out-of-the-box sessions, where we encourage people to do more interactive, more communication-oriented work. And we had a number of those examples today. There was some game playing, the videos. I thought those were very exciting, and I thought that people really enjoyed them and saw that they were very useful. So that's something we hadn't tried before. It was a bit of a should we or shouldn't we thought, and we said, let's go ahead and see what happens. And I'm very pleased it worked out.
Okay, and just before we close, what should our viewers expect tomorrow from the day, and those following the live blog especially, what are they going to see updates on, do you think?
Well, tomorrow we have a number of more sessions on various aspects of community-based adaptation. We'll then try and wrap them up and have something come out as a full summary the day after. There have been a lot of tweeting and blogging. I was just told that we have over 30,000 I forget what you call the tweet reaches already in the last 24 hours. So hopefully that will expand. And so more and more people are seeing and looking at what we're doing. Different sessions on different topics. People may have interests on agriculture, on food, or on gender, or children. We had some sessions, very good sessions on children as well. So there's something for everybody in the program tomorrow, and we hope that people will log in and watch what we're doing.
Excellent. Saleem, thank you for speaking to us again, and hopefully we'll see you tomorrow evening as well to get your perspectives on the day. We're going to go to a quick recording of a discussion with Mike Shanahan, who's actually the press officer at IIED, giving his top tips for journalists to sell their climate stories. Sorry, top tips for people to sell their climate stories to journalists. So we'll just play that in now, and then we'll be back with you shortly.